Okay, so this is the homework question. If we look down here, you've got 3 questions, 30 minutes for the question, so approximately about 15 minutes for the last question, about 10 minutes ish for the second question, and about 5 minutes, roughly 5 or 6 minutes for that one, so half an hour in total. First question, using a graph, explain, so you need some written analysis to go with the explain why road congestion represents a market failure. The market failure that you're looking for is a negative externality, so you're effectively drawing the graph for a negative externality and then explaining why it's a market failure. The case study that goes with the congestion one is the second one, congestion and road pricing. There is some data here that you could apply. There's going to be a 37% increase in demand for road space. It talks about being stuck in traffic, burning more fuel, and greater emissions in terms of the external costs. It's talking about the potential that charging people to use the roads, so effectively putting a price on roads or taxing roads, is an effective solution. The second question is an examine question, which is the same as assess, so that's a 2-sided question. The extent to which the addition of a third runway, so a significant fixed cost, would allow the owners of Heathrow to benefit from economies of scale. So as this is 2-sided, you'd need one side saying yes they would and one side saying no they wouldn't. Last question is a discuss question, so 2 sides plus a judgment, whether giving increased subsidies to firms providing bus services, so that is your market there, bus market, would correct the market failure arising from congestion. So the first question is telling you that there is a market failure of negative externalities, and here you're looking at a subsidy and whether it would or it wouldn't solve that market failure. The second question is more linked to the first case study, which tells you that there is a third runway at Heathrow. But there's not much more that you would apply to that specific question. It does talk about a significant increase in output, which I suppose is the only relevant part that you could apply. So graph for the market failure, negative externality graph, social costs higher than private costs, your free market equilibrium, your socio-optimum equilibrium. So make sure your price agrees and your quantities agree. In terms of socio-optimum, if you remember the welfare loss, there's an added benefit, costs and benefits on that axis, output there. And remember your chain of reasoning, your definition, marginal social cost being higher than marginal private cost, your application of examples of the external costs, that the price is too low because the external costs are not paid by the first party, that this leads to overconsumption at P free market and Q free market, so it's not at the socio-optimum, or another way of saying that is a loss of allocative efficiency. In terms of the second question, so what you have is the graph that would show economies of scale, and we want lower cost, higher output, and we apply this with an example. One of the key bits to be very careful with though is that this isn't talking about an airline. So the students that did this question incorrectly in the exam looked at the benefit to say British Airways of the third runway. What they didn't notice, it's actually applied to the owners of Heathrow Airport. So when you're applying it to this market, you are looking for costs to an airport rather than costs to an airline. So you could talk about something like bulk buying fuel, or you could talk about spreading the fixed costs of advertising. A definition would be a good place to start of economies of scale, and then a reference to the graph that as output increases to output 1, that the cost, or the average cost per unit, reduces to C1. Reasons why it might not. So you could just use the same graph and talk about diseconomies of scale, which would be one way to put the cost up from an increased output. Or you could talk about not fully gaining economies of scale if the increase in runway doesn't have a significant increase in capacity utilization. So there may only be a marginal reduction in cost if output increases are only small. So it depends whether or not the actual extra capacity is used. The last question, which is the discuss plus judgment, increased subsidies. So on one axis you could just draw the subsidy graph. Again, remember your labels, P's and Q's, quantity and price. Key step though is that once you have given the definition, you need to talk about it lowering the cost of production. That causes the shift inwards, that causes the extension in demand, and that leads to the quantity getting to the socially optimum. If you wanted, you could do a combined positive externality and subsidy, assuming that bus services are a positive externality because they use less emissions than cars. You could say why it doesn't work, similar to a tax of making demand inelastic and having a very small increase in quantity from the fall in price. Or you could analyse it as bus being a inferior good, and while you're subsidising there is a fall in incomes and demand for buses falls. So those are two arguments to say that you don't end up with the social optimum. What you could evaluate is it depends upon the cross elasticity of demand for cars, and it might not just be about price, it might also be about quality and convenience. So cars are more able to get you to your destination, and also to an extent the experience on cars may be a higher quality than buses. So it may depend upon how a subsidy is spent, and it might be that you look at spending that subsidy on improving the quality of buses, and if you improve the quality that might increase the cross elasticity and make the bus subsidy more effective. Or you could also argue that a subsidy plus a tax would be more effective, as the same reason you would increase the cross elasticity of demand. So you have a carrot and a stick. The carrot of the subsidy, the stick of the tax on cars, and added together, this would be the most effective way of doing it.